Hello again, art history students. Welcome to another art history remote lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the art of Africa. This is not by any means a full examination of the art of Africa. It's just a few select artworks, and then at the end of the lecture there usually is a class-wide discussion, much like we've had a couple class-wide discussions where I've tried to kind of bring you guys in and get your kind of input and try to ask thought-provoking questions, like when we talked about the Russian icons, right, with intention versus preservation, those kinds of things, just trying to get some critical thinking going. So there's like a place for that to happen, even though we're obviously not in the classroom setting where that discussion can take place. But I will still try to ask all of those questions of you, and hopefully we can get the wheels turning a little bit for you guys. So let's jump right into it. So here I just put this map in just for a little bit of context. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the area which is current day Nigeria, right? So this sort of area up in here is where we're going to focus most of our attention on. We are going to briefly go and talk about Zimbabwe, which is on the the eastern coast along the Indian Ocean. But a couple of things I want to point out. Africa is incredibly diverse in the amount of cultures that are there. Technically, it has a significant amount of countries and whatnot today, but each of those countries would have smaller like subcultures and smaller groups within them, which would have their own languages, their own history, their own priorities in the art that they're making. So again, I cannot stress this enough. This is just like a very brief kind of overlay of African art. A couple things I want to put forward is the oral history is very, very important, and that's oftentimes what the art is about. And then also kind of indicating who is in charge and how they're in charge. We're going to look at that a little bit more in depth. All right, so first we're going to talk about portraits of powerful figures and what is used to relate their how they're important and what artistic devices are used to communicate how they're important. So the first artwork we're going to look at now. All right, so this is the head of Rafin Kura. You guys know I'm really bad at pronunciation. So before we start talking about what this object actually is, I want you to really look at and kind of use those formal analysis skills, right, that we would have brought forward a while ago, and kind of look at this object, right? This is not a portrait of a specific individual with their individualized features, right? This is not a trying to create a portrait that's incredibly recognizable. We can barely tell if this was a young person or an old person. Those kinds of details are not important. And the way all of the features are broken down, they're broken down into their really basic geometric shapes, right? So we see sort of the use of triangles and domes and circles, right? Just as a way of forming the face. But yet at the same time, there is a lot communicated to us, especially through the hair and whatnot. So let's go to the next slide. So they would create these life-size hollow figures, and the heads would often be larger than the bodies. And then as part of a ritualistic burial, they would bury this figure alongside other figures in this burial area. So it's not the same as a death mask. It's not laying over top of a mask to sort of like savor that identity. It has another purpose. I want to point out that the head is larger than the body as we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a figure of Onai, and again, we're focusing our attention on the area around what is current day Nigeria. So this figure, if you kind of look at them, they tend to have, or this figure specifically has a larger head than the rest of its body. Its head is almost out of proportion. It's that much larger than the body. It's almost 1/3 the size of the body, or maybe a fourth the size of the body. And this is kind of like hierarchical scale, but within the body. So this person is a sacred character figure, right? So there would be this importance on the head, their wisdom, right? All of the things that they're an intellectual leader is basically what's being communicated by this kind of hierarchical scale of the body. So let's see another example or a similar example. There's just some information that exaggerated head communicates that spiritual connection, intellectual connection. All right, so this is a warrior leader from a similar area of the world, right? So that current day Nigeria. So what we see here is we see this large exaggeration of the hands and the feet. Look how big his legs and feet are in comparison to his head, right? And his torso. So this kind of makes sense when you take these two pieces together, the figure of Onai and then this image, which is a depiction of a warrior leader, right? If you're an intellectual leader and a spiritual leader, sort of like this is the most important, this is what makes you important to the community. And then if you're a hunter and a warrior, it's your hands and your feet and sort of your physical prowess that makes you important. So this is like hierarchical scale. It's almost could be called hierarchical proportion, perhaps. That is not a term. That's just a term I'm kind of using to get the point across to you guys. So importance within the body, what is depicted at largest implies importance to that individual. All right, so there's info on that. Okay, so this work is clearly using hierarchical scale, and what this plaque with warrior attendants is about the Obas, which is the king of this area around again current day Nigeria. That's kind of where the general area where we're focused. And what would happen is whenever a new Obas would be crowned, or what would be like a coronation ceremony, the military leaders or the warrior leaders of all the tribes that surrounded this area and were kind of under the umbrella of the king and the kingdom would come to swear their allegiance. And that's what you see here. This largest man, who is obviously the warrior attendant, right? He, or like the warrior chief of this tribe, he has this special kind of leaf blade sword, right, which is called an ebon, and then holding it up like that signifies that this group is pledging their allegiance to the new king. So after this ceremony would happen, that's when all of these plaques would be made and created to basically solidify that all of these people showed up to swear their allegiance to this new king. So something else that's kind of interesting is this is obviously the largest character. He's obviously the most important, and he's the warrior. And then he's flanked by two warrior attendants, these second largest guys here. And then all of these smaller people are members of this tribe's royal family. So that really puts into perspective who holds the most power, right? The warrior class, or the warriors within this community, would actually hold higher status than these sort of like family related dynasty would, right? And that doesn't mean that someone from this warrior class wouldn't be related to them. It just means that these are royal attendants. And this guy here has this interesting kind of flute thing that he's holding, and that would be to signify that this group is coming, much like, drums are played and that sort of stuff whenever there's any kind of military procession. So there is some some information about that. There's that term, the Obas, which is basically the kings, and then the Ebon, which is that ceremonial sword that looks kind of like a leaf. Okay, moving on. So next, within the same culture, we see these interesting things which evolve over time. So I'm showing you two examples here, and the big thing I want you to pay attention to is the collar, right, to the neck, to this kind of rolled neck on this earlier one, and then this kind of cylindrical neck on this one that's dated a couple hundred years later. These objects would signify spiritual leaders, right? And they would hold actually elephant tusks would kind of come out of the back of the head, which we've seen this over and over and over again in other cultures. The head is always the spiritual center of the body. There's always kind of this connection between the sacred realm and an individual is always portrayed via the head. And this is a progression. We can kind of see how these objects over time got taller and the necks sort of got longer and more. It's almost like less and less of the face is being shown and more of the neck. And when you see them in context of the altar, in which how they're arranged, we see that up here in this image, you can kind of see how perhaps as newer ones were created, they maybe had to change height in order to, you know, make the display happen. There's a lot of, there's theories about why they're kind of progressing through time, but this is something that there's a clear progression through time of how these objects are kind of elongating in the neck. All right, this is the twin figure. So this is kind of an interesting, I guess it's part of the sacred realm. You could almost call it like folklore or that kind of thing. But anytime there are twins in a large portion of Africa, anytime there are twins, twins are considered to be incredibly important, and the connection between twins is considered important. So if something happens and a twin passes away, there is a figure created, like an effigy, which is what this object is created of that passed away twin to hold their spirit here, so it doesn't go on to the sacred realm. What would happen is like twins are kind of like two parts of the same thing, is kind of the belief, two parts of the same soul, for lack of a better term, right? Just for using a term, the same spirit. So if one were to ascend to the sacred realm, wherever that may be, the one that would be left behind would sort of be broken. So that's why there is this figure created to hold that spirit of that twin that's passed away. So it's a very interesting kind of use for art, and really shows the importance and the power that an art object can hold in this society. All right. And again, we're still kind of in that zone around Nigeria. So harness the life force. That was a term I couldn't come up with, the life force. All right. So next we're going to talk about spiritual beings and ancestors. And the twin figure that we just looked at is kind of a good lead off into this, sort of this idea that an object can hold, you know, the spirit of a person or the life force of a person. It can also hold a lot of other power. So these ancestral rituals are going to become central to a community's belief system. And we're going to talk a lot more about ritual when we get sort of towards the end of the lecture. So this is the standing male figure, and this is used in medicine, basically, which is, in a sort of layman terms, voodoo medicine. So over time, this standing male figure has these like spikes or kind of like metal pieces inserted and then removed from him. And there's this idea that these objects are, when they're being removed, there's this change of power. This object is sort of like a reservoir for power, of a healing kind, at least in this case. And then that energy or that sacred realm tangible sacred realm power can then be transferred or whatnot. So this vessel, this object is actually like a vessel for holding sacred realm power. So it's a pretty important object when you look at it in that context. All right. So this is that word. There was no way I was ever going to pronounce that correctly. We all know that. So, but again, kind of layman's terms, we'll call it voodoo, just for layman's terms. Okay, sacred medicine. That's better. Sacred medicine. All right, so let's kind of pause here for a moment and break down some of the things that we see in this artwork. I think this artwork is incredibly important in kind of understanding some of the overall themes of African art. So first and foremost, what are we looking at? We're looking at a depiction of mother and child, and we know that this is an ancestral figure, right? So let's kind of break down some of the things. So when we looked at that figure of Onai and also that warrior chief, we kind of came up with that term, I came up with that term where it's like hierarchical proportion, where the most important part of the body is kind of exaggerated as far as in proportion to the others. So in this figure, we see that this woman's arms are so long, especially in comparison to her legs. Even if she were to stand up, she has these elongated arms and then also these elongated breasts, which are then feeding this child here, right? So that implies a lot of what her power is, or what her contribution is to the culture, right? So as this ancestral mother figure, she's the one who's kind of feeding the culture and taking care of the culture, right? We can think of that idea of like the baby in the arms kind of thing. That's why she has these elongated, elaborate arms. Another thing that's important to note is we saw a lot of depictions of mother and child, specifically in the context of Mary and Jesus. And never was there such a raw physical connection between them. The connection between Mary and Jesus that we mainly see, not that there's not examples out there, but they are few and far between, is this Mary will be holding Jesus, but it's like there's this spiritual connection between the two of them. Oftentimes, Mary's not coddling him tightly or anything like that. He's like sitting on her lap and he's got his little blessing hand out, right? So there's this spiritual connection between those two, that mother and child pair, right? Which is part of the sacred realm. And I'm comparing and contrasting them to this because this is an ancestral spirit. This is not like an individual woman and her child, right? This is part of the sacred realm belief. And this is very important, that this is how this was chosen to be depicted. And it's a much more raw and realistic version of feeding, right? And feeding and taking that. There is this physical connection between the two. There is this exaggeration of the form, right? That would kind of be brought down, those kinds of things over time. So there's this very raw depiction of motherhood, but also in a very important way, right? So we know that this mother figure has great importance within the community. So let's go to the next slide. So the nursing suggests that ancestral spirit, and those spirits are the ones that are responsible for maintaining religious and historical traditions. So this is, again, it's very important to the culture, and it's also, we can kind of understand why once you break down some of the ways in which it's exaggerated. All right, next we're moving on to personal stories and symbolism. All right, this is something that we have seen before, and it will not come as too much of a surprise to you that things like colors and materials and information can be read and understood not just as graphic depictions of people communicating in what would be like a storyline, kind of like iconography is, but also in the symbolic sense, right? That different patterns would represent different things. Okay, so this is a textile wrapper. We've kind of moved, or we're still in the West African area. This is called a kenti. I know, I'm terrible at pronunciation. But basically how this object is read is different than iconography, right? There's not a depiction of two people in conversation, right? And we know through a story who they are and what they're talking about. This is a symbolic use of color and pattern. So the gold and green and red and black would all have very specific things that color represents. We'll see that next slide. Right, so this sort of holiness and royalty and wealth and good health, all those kinds of things are what's being communicated via this textile wrapper, which was traditionally worn by royalty, and I believe it's worn in a variety of ways, like sometimes as a dress and sometimes as can be kind of folded up in a specific way to be worn as like a shirt. So there's all kinds of different ways. This is worn by both men and women. All right, bird on top of a stone monolith. This takes us to Zimbabwe, which is next to the Indian Ocean on the eastern side of the African continent. And that will become important as we migrate to the next slide. So this is bird on top of a stone monolith. And if we look at this bird, we've seen monoliths in this class before, which is basically one large piece of stone, right? Like the on Easter Island and all those giant elder statues that are on Easter Island, and then also with many other things. Stonehenge was a monolithic thing, so it's kind of a throwback term, just giving you a little bit of context. And then this is like a stela. It kind of would be placed in an area where everyone would see it and understand it. This bird is a sacred realm character. It's not a depiction of like a local bird or a bird that would be found. It has these kind of like alligator feet, and then it's the way its legs are meant to be like a predator animal's legs, kind of in a pouch. So it has alligator feet and then predator legs and then the head of a bird. So it would be a very formidable zoomorphic sacred realm creature, right? As it would have all these attributes from all these other animals, which would probably be local to the area. So again, it's not a specific bird or anything like that. It's just a combination of creatures. All right. And as part of 8, there were 8 carvings found on top. So that human, bird, crocodile, right, which is symbolic of the sky and the earth and all those kinds of things. All right, so moving on to our next Zimbabwean artwork. Oh, I was wrong. First, we're going to talk about African architecture, right? So I'm just kind of introducing this idea. We're still talking about the area of Zimbabwe, but we are going to kind of overlap with African architecture. So African architecture is made of very perishable materials, which is why a lot of it does not exist long term, and usually is tied to spiritual connections. Most of the architecture in Africa is perishable, which means it's made of wood and brick, and we will see some stone things, but that's not the common building material. So first we're going to look at something that's stone. So these are the conic towers, which are in Great Zimbabwe. So I kind of said this before. Zimbabwe is an area, that's close to the Indian Ocean, and there's a massive river that would actually allow ships to go up into inland a little bit far. And if you know anything about American history and that sort of stuff, the ability to do that, the ability to take a ship far into an inland area makes for a massive trade route, right? We saw that a little, or we kind of briefly touched on that idea when we talked about the Venetian Renaissance, but we see it also in our own history, right? The Chesapeake Bay being able to bring ships that far inland to unload and stuff, put goods farther inland. So it makes for an area where there's a lot of trade, right? There would be a significant amount of prosperity also. So back to these conic towers. These objects have an unknown purpose, and there are many, many theories about what they could be used for. So let's kind of break some of those theories down, and then we'll at least agree on something about these things' purpose. So there's a wall here, right? And we know that this is kind of an area where there's a lot of trade, and thus there would be a lot of people coming and going, right? So the first thing you would think is, with this wall here, is that this conic tower is kind of like a lookout tower for someone to stand here and maybe take a defensive position if they needed to, or something like that, right? As maybe marauders or something were on a defensive position against bad guys on the other side of the wall. But that doesn't hold a whole lot of weight, because then, I mean, this guy is almost going to fall off of this. There's no easy way for him to get up the conic tower, and then B, there's also, he's probably going to fall off very easily. It's not a good defensive position. So that theory kind of like loses, it doesn't hold water as well. So the next theory is that maybe these were sacred statues, would have stood on top of these, right? And they potentially would have communicated who is the most important person, right? Like as far as religious sacred figures or even political sacred figures could have had their statues put up there or something of that nature, right? So that holds a little bit more weight in my personal opinion, because they can be seen from the other side. From the other side of the wall, right? You can see those figures and potentially know who they are, depending on if you're kind of versed in the iconography of the area, whatever those figures may be. But either way, no matter what sort of theory you subscribe to, it's definitely important to note that this object is commanding attention and power in some way, right? Some shape or form. This object is about the prosperity of the area, that they could construct something like this that would be so tall it would be able to be seen from the other side of the wall, right? There's definitely, you could say that it could be military might, it could be sort of like religious might, but these conic towers are definitely communicating something to you as the viewer, and that something is definitely going to have to do with the prosperity of the area and the value of the area. So just a little bit more purpose, or just a little bit more information about that. Again, it was a political and religious center, so I think that kind of makes theory 2 hold a little bit more weight, but their purpose is still basically unknown. All right, so next we're moving back towards the area of current-day Nigeria. That was kind of the only 2 artworks that we looked at, was the conic tower and then those stone monoliths of the bird, the crocodile bird man, which were both in Zimbabwe. So we're moving back to the area around Nigeria. And this is the Great Mosque in Mali. So this object is the largest mud brick structure in the world. So basically what's happening is all of these little like sticks, I guess, that you see are just support beams that are sticking out of the mud brick structure, and then it's made of individual mud bricks, and then they're kind of like put over, like a stucco is put over the entire thing. So interestingly enough, I was going to show this artwork, or originally the first time I taught this class, I showed this artwork when I talked about Islamic architecture, because it is a mosque and it does follow, the interior of it does follow the same sort of plan or setup that a mosque would, but it doesn't have, it's not covered in the Islamic architecture or the geometric patterns in the same way, and it also blends a little bit of the local traditions. So if you look on top of these kind of spire things, which would be the minarets, right? So there would be 5 of them total, which you can see all 5 in this image, right? And that's where the prayer would be called from each day. Is there's actually these little, these are ostrich eggs, these little teeny tiny circles that you see. And what that is the ostrich egg in local tradition to the area is symbolic for prosperity and fertility, and not so much fertility in like a female fertility sense, but in just a prosperity sense that you know, the grounds will be fertile and those sorts of things. The whole community can prosper. So even though these are 2 separate religious traditions, they're still kind of blending them by putting that up on the top of the building. So the big takeaways that I want you to know for this building is that, let's go to the next slide, is the largest mud brick structure in the world, and those, the thing about the ostrich eggs. Another kind of fun fact, I guess Jeopardy fact, was this building was built in 1240 originally, and then it was demolished because it was thought to be too lavish and too flashy, right? The king who was in charge in the early 1800s felt that the building needed to be significantly more modest. So it was then torn down and then refinished later. So moving on. Okay, so our next artwork that we're going to talk about is the Kananga Mask. And this introduces us to the Dogon culture, which is in current day Mali, which is right next to Nigeria. So this mask is worn during a ceremony that takes place at night, which is to help someone who's passed away enter to the spirit world. And it depicts very clearly our realm, the sacred realm, and then this sort of like passage that the ceremony is about is all depicted in this mask. So if you look at this bottom part with these 2 sort of like wing things that point down, that represents our realm, right? The sort of earthly realm. And then this section with the wing things kind of pointing up is the sacred realm, and this area would be that journey. So these masks are worn during this ceremony. That's their main time that they're worn. So let's go to the next slide. So it's assisting their dead in their spiritual journey, or their journey into the spirit realm. But we're going to talk a little bit more about who these masks represent as we talk more about the Dogon culture. So let's go to the next slide. So here we see a variety of masks as they're worn sort of with the traditional garb of the Dogon. So these 3, right, have that kind of crossbeam thing above them, and then the other 2 do not. And they're all different. So they might look kind of similar, right? This one, you know, the 2 on the ends kind of have these rabbit type ears, and then the other ones don't, but they're all different. No 2 are exactly the same. And the reason for that is the Dogon believe that within their cultural society, that each member of society must be represented in this spirit realm ceremony. So that doesn't mean each individual person, that means sort of who you are in society. And who you are is oftentimes defined by your job, and that job always takes place, right? Even if the person who's doing it changes. So let me give you a good example. The best example would be the blacksmith. So to the Dogon, the blacksmith is like the master craftsman, and he's incredibly important. So think about it. This culture depends on hunting, gathering, and farming and agriculture. So they need things like arrows and knives and hoes and rakes and stuff, right? So what the blacksmith does is the blacksmith gets ore out of the ground, right? Basically rocks, and turns it into tools, right? Can you imagine a more powerful wizard, right? So that, even though that job, the job of the blacksmith, may change the individual doing that job, whoever does that, is always a really important person in society. So let's talk about the Dogon today for a second. So the Dogon are still around, pretty much existing as they have for a very long time, but the 21st century world is starting to encroach. They have an agreement with the Mali government, which is similar to how the Native Americans, right? They're like separate from other government goings on. They're a little bit of a sort of like culture that's, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's the best example that I can come up with. They're kind of like the Amish and the Native Americans together, right? They're living their traditional lifestyle. They do not want to be bothered. They do not want to be, they do not have any real interest in sort of joining 21st century world. So, but that is that is starting to change. So let's talk about that progression. So throughout history, there have been all of these important figures to the community, and that has changed, right? So the blacksmith has always been a traditional person of significant importance. But at one point in time, this area of Africa was colonized by the French. If you remember when we talked about the Maori people in New Zealand, remember how I explained the idea of like this sort of liaison officer that went between them and the British, right? And it was kind of like a go-between, right? There was a similar thing to the French between the Dogon and the French colonizing government. And that person became so important to the culture that a mask was created for them, right? They were immortalized in this mask as this part of the community, right? And then thus that person who was part of the community, or that position, right? That's kind of the key term here, that position of that community member, right? Because that person would change over time, obviously, would play a role in this ascension for the dead between our realm and the spirit realm. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an image of the mask ceremony in progress, but traditionally it would have been done at night. That makes sense. The sacred realm for the people of the Dogon culture is the stars, right? The celestial bodies, and they have a whole a whole cosmic understanding and a whole sort of pantheon of where people come from and what stars are important and all that kind of stuff. But it makes sense that this would happen during the night. But here we see in this image that it's happening during the day. The Dogon, similar to the Native Americans and a little bit to the Amish, are slowly but surely starting to become kind of like a tourist attraction. And this is putting pressure on that cultural evolution. So if the Dogon, if making these masks is like if you could imagine it like a growing, living, breathing tradition, right? As new people come into the culture's sphere, right? As this French liaison officer comes into the community and becomes important, he's then immortalized in a mask. We can also assume that as over time, there may have been other positions that may have fallen off. I doubt they have a mask to the person who is the French colonial liaison officer anymore, but they did at one time. So this kind of idea that this culture can grow and change as what's important to it grows and changes, right? That leads us to this kind of concern, could they stall because they're like a tourist attraction? And whenever tourists go to anywhere, they want to see the traditional stuff, right? They don't want to see the stuff that's now important to the culture, which might be the Wi-Fi guy, right? I want to make a mask to the Wi-Fi guy. He's important to me. The guy who comes and fixes the Wi-Fi, he's way important to me. That's how you're getting this video right now. Thus, he needs to be immortalized in a mask. But would a tourist want to see that? Would the Dogon want to keep this tradition evolving? Could they in the 21st century? And would this kind of like this tourism thing stall that out? So let's go to the next slide. Oh, this just the slides, not the slide I thought. All right, so those funeral rituals are called Dhamma, right? That's that dance that you're seeing in the previous picture. And again, these characters change throughout time. What characters are most important and what positions are sort of represented in this imagery or in this ritual. So this is kind of the slide where I wanted to ask you guys all of the questions. So we just got done learning about neoclassicism and how, was a bad circle, how neoclassicism was influenced, or how it sort of drew on the stories and traditions from the Renaissance. And when the Renaissance was happening, we learned that it was drawing from Rome, and how Rome saw themselves as the inheritor of the Greek art tradition. So there's sort of this, there's always this reaching back sort of thing that's happening. And I had that kind of graph that I drew on the board once upon a time. I can't even remember when, back when we learned about the Jomon culture. So I want you to think about external influences, right? Could a culture of tourists and tourism, could that stall this culture? And could they then stall the evolution of these masks and the evolution of who is important? Could that be a bad thing in the sense that that culture then is no longer evolving? Now, is that, if that's the case, if they can't evolve, and you might be thinking, well, that's terrible, is that better or worse than if they had to give up that cultural tradition? At least people who are making indigenous artworks, right, whether that be with the Dogon or whoever, at least they're still preserving those cultural traditions, right? And isn't that something that they would then want to keep alive? So even if it's stalled but still there, isn't that better than being lost? So how is that sort of affecting the art of the future, the art specifically? Because I could say to you guys, right, like you're all at a point in your lives where you're choosing what you want to do for the rest of your life. Imagine if you went to your parents and you said, you know what, West Virginia has this really wonderful history of broom making, right? And I have decided that I am going to be a traditional broom maker, and that is going to be my occupation and career, right? Are your parents going to want that for you? Right? You might see it as your responsibility to keep the broom making craft alive for generations to come. But is it, you guys are kind of seeing the pros and cons, the sort of like where does this leave this culture, specifically with their art, right? We could have an extended conversation about the social political implications, which I kind of started to get into with that whole idea of the broom making thing. But, what does that mean for that art? Does that art then go into a new phase, kind of like we've seen in this sort of like Western tradition, where there's sort of this denotation between this group and this group because something happened in between them, and that they would then have to reach back? Because they've kind of seen it as just a slow progression through time, right? And maybe here's where the liaison officer was created, and here's where the liaison officer stopped being important, right? But it was just a slow, smooth thing. There wasn't all these breakdowns. So are we looking at our art tradition wrong? Should we just be looking at it as this smooth transition, right, between Greece to neoclassicism? Is there no breaks? Is there no reason to denote them as something different in between? It's just kind of different ways of looking at art and art history. I really wish that we would have got to have a conversation about it in person together, but that's just how it is. So this got a little bit long. I hope you had a little bit of critical thinking going on. I hope you all stay happy and healthy. Email me if you have any questions.